All right, if I could have your attention, please. Thank you. All right, let me refresh your memory about where we were when I had finished my lecture on Tuesday. So I had been talking to you about this controversy that took place in California. California is, by the way, not the only state in which such controversies have taken place, but the one in California was certainly the most sustained controversy, and the one in which there was the greatest amount of intervention from people on both sides. The controversy I'm referring to here is, of course, a controversy over the California standards, as they're called, for textbooks. And in this case, the controversy revolved around the history standards, particularly representations of other cultures, and to narrow it down even further, the representation of India, ancient Indian history, and Hinduism in history textbooks in the School of California. And when I say that this controversy is to be distinguished by the fact that you had intervention on both sides, substantial intervention on both sides, the both sides I'm referring to are, on the one hand, a group of people who, in a manner of speaking, really claim to represent all Indians and certainly all Hindus. Right? And these are people who essentially are arguing that these textbooks offer certain representations of Indian history and of Hinduism which are unacceptable because these kinds of representations encourage the sort of stereotyping and ignorance that is quite prevalent with respect to knowledge about India in the United States, right? And they had given, as I mentioned to you in my previous lecture, something like 225 proposed changes. And then on the other hand, you have largely scholars, some people, more in the public domain, broadly speaking, but I would say largely scholars and activists who felt that many of these proposed changes were in fact actually quite unacceptable. And at the point at which I terminated my lecture on Tuesday, I was pointing to one of these proposed changes, and this particular proposed change was that the history textbooks with respect to the section on India said that, well, in India women had different rights than men, because the argument that this group of people wanted to make was that one couldn't infer from the fact that patriarchy was common in the West, right? That therefore patriarchy was common in India as well. And I think that in general I want to suggest to you that there is something to be said about the argument that one should be careful about using the experience of European history, the experience of the West, to try to understand the rest of the world. I think that if you look at the general template, there's no question. But in this particular case, I've tried to suggest to you there is very little to support the view that women were emancipated in ancient India. Right? So I suggested to you that this argument that women had different rights is in fact a way of disguising the truth. And the truth, undoubtedly, if one looks at whatever we know about ancient India, is that women, as in India, as is the case in almost any other civilization that we can think of, were essentially discriminated against. They had a second-class status in this civilization as it did in all other civilizations. Right? But nonetheless, having said that, I want to be very clear that one could argue that there are notions of masculinity and femininity which work differently in cultures. Okay, and that our understanding of this should not necessarily be bound by modern notions of what we think of as the relationship between the sexes in all of the civilizations, so forth and so on. Okay. Now, one of the organizations that comes into this dispute is this California Parents for the Equalization of Educational Materials, and I was suggesting to you that this is a very clever way, frankly, to disguise what this organization is all about, because the people who are behind this organization are people who are Indians, Hindus specifically, middle-class Hindu parents living in the United States, with certain conceptions about their own faith, certain conceptions about ancient Indian history. And of course one has to ask a question that I'm not going to attempt to resolve for you over here. One has to ask, where did they derive their understanding of India from? What kind of textbooks do they use? Because one of the fundamental problems is that many modern-day Hindus, their understanding of Hinduism is in fact derived from the colonial past. It's derived largely from texts which were shaped in some ways by the long period of colonial rule through which India went. Right? So California parents for the equalization of educational materials. And we looked at each of these words here because of course, one of the things that the organization is able to do quite successfully is to project itself as some kind of secular democratic organization which is really fundamentally interested simply in the idea that every religion and culture should receive equal representation. Right? They're trying to find something that is going to be unobjectionable. Because let's suppose that they had described this organization as Hindu parents agitating for the rights of Indians and rights of Indians and the manner in which they represented in California, something like that. Right? I mean, overtly that would present certain kinds of problems. It would look like an attempt of partisanship. This is a very different way to project the strength of this community. Yes.
I was wondering, were their objections mostly about the presentation of India in the textbooks, or were they also concerned about the portrayal of Indians in America?
Portrayal of Indians in America, no, that's not a question that really comes up. The reason it doesn't come up is because the textbooks are strictly dealing with, in this case, the history of India, particularly the ancient period moving down into the medieval period. The textbooks here are not, it's like my son, for example. I mean, he's a student right now. I've seen his textbook. I mean, the period that they're talking about is the ancient Indian past, what Ashoka was doing, the emergence of Buddhism in India. It doesn't speak anything about how Indians are being represented in America today or what their status is in American society. But your question is an interesting one. So, for example, let's supposing that the textbook says that Hindus believe in a monkey god called Hanuman. Let's just suppose that the text actually says something like that. And of course, if you put it in those bland terms, well, someone who has no familiarity with that culture would obviously come to the inference that this is a rather peculiar kind of religion. Why would they worship a monkey god? Okay? And therefore, the argument really is that this puts the Indians in a rather peculiar position, the Indians living in America. That their school children, when they go to school, they are taunted and they're told that, well, you believe in a monkey god or something like that. Right? This is implicitly the claim. I mean, in some cases, by the way, this is explicitly the claim that this is one reason they're concerned. It's not simply how Indian history is being represented and whether this history is authentic or not, but what are the consequences for Indian Americans living in the state of California today. Yeah.
I was just wondering because I know it's kind of controversial amongst other Indian Americans about their histories and how they're kind of underrepresented, how the Sikh community was participating in
Yes. Yeah. But you see, what I'm suggesting to you, without getting into the details about each set of representations, is what I'm suggesting to you is that there may, in fact, actually be legitimate questions, which is one reason, legitimate questions about the nature of representations, which is one reason why, as I pointed out to you in my previous lecture, that the people on the other side, there are a large number of changes that they agree with. Both sides are in agreement about certain kinds of changes. So if there are patent errors of fact, for example, okay, so patent errors of fact would be that, let's supposing Ashoka lived in the 4th century BC, and you say in the textbook says that he lived in the 4th century AD. Well, that's a patent error of fact, and obviously needs to be rectified. But we're not speaking about errors of fact here. We're speaking about questions of judgment and interpretation. Right? That's what we're speaking about. So when for example, these people object that, these people object that Hinduism is being represented as a polytheistic faith, but that in fact it is a monotheistic faith. Well, that's a problem now. And there's a problem there because the very categories called polytheism and monotheism are categories that would have been used in the understanding of Semitic faiths and the faiths that are different from them in the West. I mean, these are categories that have essentially come about as a consequence of the study of religion in the West for a long period of time. These are not categories that Indians necessarily use themselves to understand the nature of their faith. And why Hindus should feel compelled to argue that Hinduism is in fact a monotheistic faith, that's the more interesting question. And the reason they feel compelled has to do, obviously, with what happened to their long period of colonial rule when a distinction came about between the Abrahamic faiths, which according to the colonial state and colonial officials and European scholars were the true, genuine, authentic faiths, and then the other faiths were, particularly faiths such as Hinduism, were in fact actually inauthentic faiths. They weren't even sure what these religions were really. Yes?
Yeah, but they're still negotiating. What is the system? They're not challenging.
What's that, sorry?
When you argue that they're monotheistic,
yeah.
they're not challenging the system that's trying to label them. They're negotiating with it.
But that's exactly what I'm saying, right? That they're not in fact actually questioning the category called monotheism and the category called polytheism. What they're in effect doing is they're saying that, look, I mean, the template of religion as we understand it, and incidentally I have to say that this is a fundamental problem in the study of religion. And the fundamental problem is that in civilizations such as those of India, there is no word for religion. Absolutely no word at all. Okay? And this is true largely, in fact, there's a friend of mine who has argued that east of the Suez Canal there isn't a single group of people who actually had a term for the word religion. Well, maybe we don't want to accept that, but certainly it is very clear that there are a large number of civilizations or cultures, okay, in what is called the East, right, which had no word for religion. So the word that is used in Sanskrit is dharma, but if you look up a Sanskrit dictionary, a Sanskrit English dictionary, the entry is 3-4 pages long. And the reason why it's that long is because the word dharma means morality, law, conduct. In fact, it means almost whatever you want it to mean.
So why are they doing it? Why are they legitimizing something that they're challenging?
Can you say the question again?
Why are they legitimizing something that they're challenging?
Why are who's they? The people here.
The Indians.
Why are they legitimizing? Well, because that has to do with the fact that they have inherited a colonial framework of knowledge which they do not understand. That's why. That's exactly the problem here. Your question is, why are they using these categories? And that's exactly the question that I'm asking, because they should not be putting forth an objection saying that, look, Hinduism is not a polytheistic faith, it's a monotheistic faith. The real question is, why are they even interested in making that distinction and accepting the legitimacy of this distinction? The reason why they're interested in it has to do with the fact that in the European template of what is called religion, it was very clear that the monotheistic faiths were what were considered to be the authentic, genuine faiths. And that all of these other faiths, such as Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth and so on, are in some ways inauthentic faiths. Right? So this is one of the debates that is going to come up during the California textbooks controversy, and this is a debate that is largely going to be conducted over the internet. So now we've got multiple points that we're making here. One point that we're making is that, and here incidentally we're talking about something that took place in 2006, 2007. So quite recently. So what we're suggesting are, let me put them in serial order, a number of things. First, the Indian community at this point was obviously in a position of some affluence and influence. And a community that feels that it now has the strength to be able to intervene in certain kinds of social settings. So 20 years ago, for example, if the Indian community had attempted to make an intervention of that kind, they would have been much less successful. Now there are numbers to back them. The community is highly educated. Right? Looking at it in the totality of things, compared to the educational achievements of other ethnic groups, including white Americans. So what we're saying is that this controversy itself is a testimony to the fact that the position of Indians in countries such as the United States had altered very substantially over the course of the last few decades. Number two, they are becoming much more aggressive in projecting their own conception of what Hinduism means and what they understand by Hinduism, and correspondingly becoming much more aggressive in projecting the rights of Indians as Hindus, not just as Americans, but as Hindus. That, and I'm going to speak to this question again in week 10 when we sort of begin to contemplate what is the future of Indians in the diaspora. But this is a nice juncture to anticipate some of those comments. And in this connection, what I'm trying to suggest is that there is a considerable anxiety that the Indian community in the United States has had over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades. And this anxiety stems from the fact that the community feels that Hinduism, and there are many sources of that anxiety, but I'm describing one that is most germane to the argument at this particular juncture, and that is that there is this widespread perception that Hinduism is a largely invisible faith in the United States. And by invisible is meant the fact that people have virtually no awareness of what it means to be a Hindu. And therefore, the fact that Hindus might have certain conceptions of life and might have also certain rights as Hindus, which are not properly respected in the United States. Okay, this is something that I'm suggesting to you has been experienced and felt by the community. And these kinds of interventions are now attempts to rectify that situation. These are attempts to make Hindus more visible in the public domain. So even if, for example, I haven't told you what the outcome was, right, of all of these. Well, I've told you in part that some of the proposed changes were accepted by people on both sides. And then there are some changes which are not accepted. Okay, and the reason they're not accepted is because there was a large group of scholars working largely on India in the United States who then came into this controversy, again, mainly through the internet, started sending letters to the California School Board, to the government, and to various media organizations saying that, well, these people who are claimed to be speaking for all Hindus are not speaking for all of them. They're only speaking for certain Hindus. We are also scholars of Indian society. Many of us are Indians, and we don't agree with many of these proposed changes. And of course, one of the reasons why they carried some weight was because this was a group of scholars, whereas this organization, for example, for the most part, did not really have much scholarly backing. These were Hindus from the community who felt aggrieved, right, but obviously could not command the same kind of attention because they didn't have, if I may put it this way, the scholarly apparatus to be able to prove some of the points that they were fighting for. Okay, so the two things that I pointed out to you is that, one, that there is obviously this controversy obviously reflects the fact that Indians had now achieved a certain position in American society, in American civil society, which emboldened them to think that, well, they can make a difference now. And secondly, they are now starting to become much more aggressive about the nature of Hinduism and its representations in the public domain. And thirdly, the use of the internet, the deployment of the internet, is a critical factor in this controversy. That would not have been the case again 20 years ago. And of course, we will therefore have to ask certain questions such as, what is the nature of citizenship in the digital age? How does one exercise one's rights as a citizen? That's what these people are purporting to do. They're saying that we're citizens of the United States, we are parents in the state of California, we have a vested interest in this kind of question, right? And we're going to exercise our rights. And of course, the question here that I'm posing for you is, how does citizenship get exercised in the digital age? Are there different kinds of consequences? Are there different kinds of ramifications? so forth and so on. What are the protocols? Yes.
Going back to point two.
Going back to what, sorry?
Point two, the anxiety. I was just wondering if you could maybe list some indications of the anxiety.
You'll have to speak up just a bit. Indications of what, sorry?
Indications of the anxiety.
Oh, indications of anxiety. Oh, lots of indications. I'll give you one simple illustration. This might seem like an odd way of putting it, but that's why I want to give you a dramatic example. 9/11. Okay? Now, 9/11, of course, puts the Muslim community into disrepute. But there are Hindu nationalists who, in a perverse way, will say that, look, one advantage that Muslims have over us is they get press. It may be bad press all the time, but at least people notice Islam. They notice Muslims. Right? If you look, for example, pick up the New York Times any day. Pakistan gets disproportionate amount of attention. This always rankles the Indians living in the United States, because their view is Pakistan, what is Pakistan? It's a two-bit dictatorship. Okay? And this country hogs the limelight. It gets the news all the time. Of course, the news may be all bad news. It may all be about the Taliban, about bombs exploding all over the streets of Karachi and Lahore, right? Shias being massacred every day by the Sunnis, whatever. Right? That may be the news, but at least it's in the news. The problem with the Indian community, this is the anxiety, is frankly, Indians are just more or less invisible. The only time anyone takes any notice of them is that when somebody goes into a motel and it happens to be run by a Patel. And therefore you know that, well, there's some Indian connection there vaguely, remotely, but otherwise, where is India in the news? Right? Who cares about India? This is what I mean by the anxiety. Now, I'm giving you a very dramatic illustration because there are all kinds of anxieties that had to do with what is the nature of Hinduism, how is it represented in the media, why are certain kinds of representations very common. We're going to look at this, by the way, in much greater detail later on, when I'm going to look at an organization such as AHAD, AHAD, acronym, American Hindus Against Defamation, right, which has been very active. Why has it been very active? Because this particular organization says that, hey, people are disrespectful towards Hinduism. And the illustrations that they give, many illustrations. Beer bottles with a photograph of Ganesh. Toilet seats with Indian deities put on those toilet seats. Shoes and slippers with an image of Shiva or Vishnu or Ganesh. Right? This is the argument, that nobody really pays any respect to Hindus. And that's not because people are deliberately malicious about Hinduism. It's just that there's this widespread wholesale ignorance about Hinduism. And one of the reasons why Americans are perversely attracted towards Hinduism, some of them, very few, because for the most part it's invisible, but then there are those few going back to the 60s, right? There are these very small constituencies who are attracted towards the spiritualism, the mysticism of the Orient. And why are these people? That's a different kind of problem, because Hinduism is a colorful religion. Right? Look at all these gods and goddesses proliferating all over the place. Look at their festivals. There's light, there's color. Christianity, Islam, these are austere religions, extremely austere religions. Right? From the standpoint, this is how the Hindus are thinking to themselves, the ones who are involved in these kinds of agitations. So I hope that gives you some sense of what I'm talking about when I speak about this anxiety. Yes?
So does Indian culture correlate with Hinduism? Because I feel like in America, and this is probably just my little scope of experience with Indians, but Indian culture is so relevant and known, widely known, like Bollywood, the Indian clothes, the dress, places like Artesia, the food. Yeah,
but you see that, all right, there are two considerations that are important here. One is when you say it's widely known. It's widely known among certain constituencies in the metropolitan centers of the United States. Right? So, you're living in Los Angeles. Okay? You're living in Los Angeles, go down to Mississippi. Okay? Or go down to Alabama. And find out how many people really know what a samosa is. Okay? or even what Bollywood is. So you're not going to be able to make inferences from what happens in the big metros in New York or Washington or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco, right? And extrapolate from that to the rest of the country. But the more interesting answer to your question is that these are all elements, from the point of view of the Hindus, these are all elements of exoticism. And I tried to anticipate your question already by suggesting something, that Hinduism is seen as a religion of color. It's so colorful. There are so many thousands of gods and goddesses, and you go into a mosque, of course, idolatry is not allowed. And even in Protestant Christianity, one of the fundamental transformations that took place with the coming of Protestant Christianity was the elimination of the saints. And all of Christian art is shaped around the life of Jesus, Mary, and the saints. You go to any museum of art and look at the representations of Saint Sebastian, Saint Jerome. This is what, in fact, actually enabled Western art. Right? Now, all of that is anathema from the Protestant point of view. So, Hinduism is seen as an exceedingly colorful religion, and Indian culture is seen in the same light. So that's why the big festivals that some people have a knowledge of would include those festivals where you have public demonstrations of the Hindu faith in some vague sense of the term. And that would include Diwali, Holi. Now they even celebrate Holi, by the way. My children just went and celebrated it about a month ago, in Malibu. 2,000 people had gathered together. They had big buckets, of color and everything, splash around, and there are quite a few white people there. Hey, it's fun. Now, whatever the particular religious associations might be of these festivals, all of that is lost sight of. And this is what, in fact, actually, many of these Hindus are upset by. They're upset by what one might describe as a kind of secularization, right, of Hinduism, which is what makes it possible for some white people, some non-Indians more generally, to partake of that religion. But that is still a minuscule minority. By and large, the argument is this is a religion that is largely invisible in the American domain. That, everybody in this country knows the word Islam. They might not know what the religion stands for. They might not know what it stands for. They might not know what zakat means, what it means to do namaz, or why a Muslim should undertake the Hajj. They might not know any of that. There may be a small set of people who will know that, but everybody somehow knows that there is something called Islam and that its adherents are known as Muslims. Right? But Hinduism, the argument would be, it's just completely in the domain of darkness. Right? From the vantage point of America, that this is a large world about which there is overwhelming ignorance. And this is what I mean when I said that, in a way, the presence of Pakistan in the newspapers, however bad the press might be for Pakistan, many of these nationalist Hindus, they resent the fact that Pakistan is constantly appearing in the news. Right? So this is the kind of irony that I think you would have to contemplate. But we need to move on. All right. So let India develop campaign. This is another front, if I may put it this way. And if you look at the column on the right, you can see that this group is again associated with the group that you had heard about previously, California Parents, because on the right there is this link called "What is a California Hindu Textbook Controversy All About?" Right? California Hindu Textbook Controversy All About. And of course, here you have another sophisticated attempt in a way, because their argument is that the people who want to obstruct these changes are people who do not wish to see India develop. Okay, and who could be opposed to development? I mean, don't we all believe in development? This is what they're banking on, this idea. Right? And of course, we could get into the whole ideology of development. Well, what does development mean? Who is development for? But they are using this word in the generic sense that everybody believes vaguely in something called development, that it's good. We like to see people develop. We like to see nations develop. Right? So they're using this front now to advance exactly the same claim that is made by the other organization. Right? And then this is, remember what I'm projecting here is what I'm calling the universe of internet Hinduism. What happens, so the larger question that we started off with on Tuesday was, what are the transformations that take place in a religion? It could be Hinduism, it could be Islam, it could be Christianity, Judaism. Here we are looking at Hinduism. What are the transformations that take place when religion enters the domain of cyberspace? How does a religion get transformed? What is the people's understanding of their faith? Do religious practices, forms of worship, get altered? Will the texts that have maintained a certain kind of importance in that religion, will they continue to maintain that importance? And there are very pressing questions. Does the internet lead to the democratization of religion? And what do I mean by that? That if you have multiple points of origin, you've got thousands, millions of websites, thousands of people projecting themselves as authorities. Right? I mean, look at Amazon. I mean, everybody who logs in a comment on a book, whether they understand it or not, is projecting himself or herself as some kind of authority on this book. And of course, there are others who may be taking that seriously. Right? So what is going to happen to the authority of traditional priests? I'm talking about looking at it over the long run. It may be a little bit too early to say. But this is the larger set of questions that we are interested in. And this is the backdrop to something like this, the Hindu universe. Right? So here is a website which is all-encompassing, the Hindu universe. Right? It's like the cosmos. So and then of course there are going to be thousands of links going from this website to many other websites as well. Now, if you look further down there, and this is the reason why I have this, so we're going to look at this. This goes back to the question that was asked about what kind of anxieties there are. Issues in the middle column there, issues actively pursued by AHAD with public participation. AHAD is American Hindus Against Defamation. Right? And then they give you a list of some of the kinds of issues that they are confronting, some of the forms of discrimination that they are fighting. Okay? Now, let's look at this particular instance of the kind of anxiety. And I have to be very clear that I think that there are problems with these kinds of things becoming part of the public domain. But nonetheless, I have problems with how this particular organization deals with it. Right? So there's a series of dolls that were brought out by this company. If you go to the internet, you can see them incidentally. They're still being sold, many of them. And they're called the trash talkers. So they have 7 dolls in this series, and all of these, of course, replicate certain kind of stereotypes. So you have princes, you have Marshall, Mr. Patel, right? Lee Chan, so that's of course a representation of a Chinese, pimp, so on and so forth. This is the Mr. Patel doll. And you know, if you can click a button on the doll, and the dolls are programmed to utter 5 things. So phrase 1, phrase 2, one of the things that they're mocking is the Gujaratis, alleged lack of command over the English language. Okay, that the Gujaratis really in the United States really, still doesn't speak proper English, sort of mumbles, is not at ease really. That's the implication, is not really at ease in American culture. So for example, phrase 3, you click on this and then the doll will say, so imagine a Gujarati going to a McDonald's, a pure vegetarian, hamburger, everything on it please, but no beef. Right? And of course you can pun on it because you can say, well, why have any beef over this issue, right? You could. This is exactly one of the things that I would argue that, yes, these dolls might be offensive, but the question is, how should we now channel our feeling of indignity and offense? What should we do about it? Right? Should we do anything about it at all? Should we contest this in some other way? Right? And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because you're living in a culture where the market is the dominant idea, the idea of the market. And the market, frankly, does not respect things like sensibilities and cultures. It doesn't, for the most part. So these dolls themselves have to be understood as part of what you might call a market morality, where everything really goes. everything is more or less up for sale. If you're really going to contest this, what you're going to have to contest in some ways is this kind of market ethos that has become the dominant strand of thinking in the United States. And of course now is catching on in countries like India as well. All right? And here is this American Hindus Against Defamation, Hindus outraged at images of gods and goddesses on shoes. And so what Ahad did in all of these cases, by the way, there are at least 10 or 15 cases that one can think of. I mean, what they would usually do is they would usually send a letter off to the company, in this case the company that makes these shoes, and say, you know, please remove these shoes from the market, right? And usually this demand was accompanied by a demand for an apology. Now, frankly, we are swimming in a sea of apologies at this point in time. There's an epidemic of apologies that goes back to 20 years. You know, everybody is apologizing to everybody else for, you know, the sins committed by their forefathers. So yes, we're going to apologize to African Americans for slavery. We're going to apologize to the Native Americans, you know, for the genocide that we did. The Japanese are going to apologize to the Koreans because of the comfort women. They're going to apologize to the Chinese because of the brutalities inflicted in places like Nanking. You know, there've been dozens of apologies. Then once you've issued the apology, then you go about doing what you've been always doing. Right? That is the norm of apologies. I mean, so for example, the United States has, and Western European powers have issued countless number of apologies, you know, for this or that atrocity committed, you know, during colonialism. And then you go around and you start fighting a war in places where you've got no business to be fighting a war. Iraq, Afghanistan, so forth and so on. Right? See, so these people, what am I saying? What I'm saying is that they don't understand. This group does not understand what is the politics of this kind of cultural representation and how one might make an intervention in the public domain. What they're asking for is a standard American way of dealing with these issues. And this standard way has been completely packaged. It's been completely packaged. Dissent has been packaged. See, that's what I'm suggesting to you. So therefore, I'm saying to you that, in fact, what these people are doing is they're simply falling into this trap of thinking that there is really only one way to deal with this kind of question. We are living in a multicultural society. These forms of representation are offensive. I agree they're offensive. I'm not disagreeing with that. The question has to do with how does one respond. Okay? And when a group comes up called American Hindus Against Defamation, well, what is defamation? Okay? It's like, for example, blasphemy, the idea of blasphemy. I mean, many people have argued that certain texts ought to be banned because they're blasphemous. But there is no conception of blasphemy in Hinduism, none whatsoever. This is again a category that we derive from Western understandings, and the notion of blasphemy has a particular relationship to the history of Christian thought and Christian texts, and how these were received, and what were the consequences of going against the grain. Right? But the notion of blasphemy in a highly decentered faith such as Hinduism has no resonance at all. And this is exactly the same problem I have with a category called defamation, because really there's only one response to something like defamation in the United States, and that is a legal response, usually. Right? So what they're doing, you could say, is to in fact playing the American game in some sense of the term. Both the people who are manufacturing these and the people who are responding to it. All right? And this is a little slide where there's this group now that has come up. Very interesting. You'll have to look at the bottom right-hand side of this slide here. 2011, Hindus in South Asia and the Diaspora. This is an annual report published by the Hindu American Foundation. Where did they get this model from? And what does this report do? So the Hindu American Foundation is a foundation that was set up only about 15 years ago. Right? It's run by these young professionals, second generation. Right? So these are Indians born in the United States. Couple of the people here are doctors. A couple of people here work in areas such as public policy. One is a lawyer. Okay? And what is their main claim? Their main claim is that, look, they grew up in the United States. They were always made to feel ashamed about being Hindus when they were going to school. They remember that vividly. This is what they claim. Okay? And I'm not one to dispute their claim. If that's what they say happened to them, well, that's what happened to them. It didn't happen to me, but that's what they claim about what happened to them. That they always felt rather awkward and embarrassed because some white kid in the school, when they were going to school, would say, hey, why do you have a monkey god? Why does this goddess have 10 arms? Okay? You know, isn't this a weird and funny religion? And so they're saying that, well, you know, we don't want our children to go through the same thing. Okay? We want people to be aware of it. Now, this all sounds very innocuous and innocent. Right? And so what do? They publish an annual report on the atrocities imposed upon Hindus, okay, in South Asia and the diaspora. South Asia here means, of course, Pakistan and Bangladesh, where Hindus are being oppressed, and elsewhere, where you have large Hindu populations. What is happening to the Hindu population? Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname. Right? So they're going to like police it. This is exactly what the United States does. This is where they got the model from. It's the US State Department which publishes a report every year. Human rights around the world. Well, what gave the United States the authority to, you know, monitor human rights violations all over the world? Right? Exactly the same model is being used by the Hindu American Foundation. Right? So this is where I think it gets very interesting, because we begin to see how they've essentially internalized American democratic procedures as they see it. Certain procedural norms, and how these can be deployed effectively in the public domain. Right? And of course they have the confidence to do it because these are young Indian Hindu professionals doing quite well, and they're living in the largest and richest and most influential country in the world. Imagine if you had Hindus in Trinidad who said, we're going to bring out an annual report about violations committed against Hindus all over the world. Would anybody even pay the remotest attention to that? No. Your location makes a substantial difference. Right? It makes a very substantial difference. And this is exactly what these Hindu American Foundation personnel are capitalizing on. Right? And so here you get a little close-up of this particular, the cover. Now, HinduUnity.org. So what is HinduUnity.org? And again, you see, each of these slides is worth commenting on at very substantial length. We have to sort of proceed rather quickly, so I'm giving you a short commentary. The idea of unity, Hindu unity. The claim, implicit claim, is that one of the problems with the Hindu community is precisely the fact that it is so scattered. And by this they don't mean simply that Hindus are physically scattered. That's a rather good thing, because there should be a Hindu presence everywhere. But rather that this is such a decentered faith. It's such an extraordinarily decentered faith that it's hard to bring Hindus together on a common platform. Right? So they want to suggest that the imperative thing for Hindus to do is to, in fact, actually unite. Right? And then it says, united we shall fight to preserve our heritage so that we can pass the light to our children. And then in smaller print there, HinduUnity.org is an organization dedicated to Hindutva. What does Hindutva mean? I've talked about that word before. The essence of being Hindu. Hindutva and Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu state, right? Dedicated to the idea of a Hindu state, a Hindu nation. Nation would be the better word here. And of course, this is a call for transforming India into a Hindu nation. Bajrang Dal, so the official website, warriors of the Hindutva revolution. Now you'd have to start bringing in all kinds of notions of masculinity, projecting yourself as hyper-masculine in some ways. Right? We are going to create a revolution. Warriors of the Hindutva revolution. We as members of the Bajrang Dal, so Bajrang Dal is this army of Hanuman, literally, right? Swear in the name of Lord Hanuman to always remain prepared to protect our country, religion, and culture. Protect it against whom? When you're protecting, you're also protecting it against somebody's encroachments. We know who that somebody is, right? Obviously. Muslims. And so if you look at this slide here now, extraordinary, right? Because this is from their website. Now you would think that if it's a site having to do with the Hindu faith and Hindu religion and so forth and so on, well, they'll talk about what Hindu religion is. Right? But this slide, the problem incipient in this slide goes back to 20 years ago, when the Global Hindu Electronic Network was put up. You remember that slide I'd shown you? And the discussion I had about this Global Hindu Electronic Network, GHEN, one of the first websites of its kind that was put up nearly 20 years ago. Now, if you went to GHEN, half the links there had to do not with understanding Hinduism, they had to do with Muslim terrorism, with Pakistan, with what Pakistan is doing in Kashmir, how the Muslims with their birth rate are going to take over India and create a new Pakistan, so forth and so on. Right? Very odd, because it's a website dedicated to Hindu culture, Hindu religion, Hindu gods, goddesses, festivals. Well then, why are you lavishing half your time on the very religion that you purport to hate, namely Islam? And this is here, Allah is the Muslim's teacher and the Holy Quran, of course in quotation marks, right? Holy Quran is their guide. Are you willing to fight back and protect Hinduism and Judaism? That's another interesting link. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Okay? Why Hinduism and Judaism? Why are the Hindus so interested here? And this website, by the way, is put up in the United States. It's not put up in India. It's put up here. And the guy who actually put it up, he eventually had to bring it down because it was so inflammatory. It was so inflammatory that there were complaints, and eventually the FBI had to move in and they had to shut it down. Of course, what he does is he finds other ways, other mirror sites, all right? Are you willing to fight back and protect Hinduism and Judaism? They will not stop until you teach them a lesson. Who is they? Right? Learn the techniques and information, and then the website. Hindus and Jews must unite as one and fight oppression and terrorism for our people around the world. So here's my question for you. Supposing you got this question on the exam, right? Why is it that Hindu nationalism, this site is a living demonstration of that. Why is it that Hindu nationalists in the United States feel that they should unite with Jews in particular, okay, to contest the oppression of Islam? What would you say? The answer in some ways is self-evident, but then there are some complexities to that answer, right? Okay. You want to say it a bit louder, because I'm not sure. Did everybody hear it?
My enemy is my friend.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So obviously the Jews and the state of Israel, not that the two are synonymous, because there are plenty of Jews who are not in the state of Israel, but Jews and the state of Israel are enemies of Islam, and therefore they're my friend, right? Old principle, one of the oldest principles. Anything else that comes to mind? Let's try to complicate the picture a bit here. Say that again.
You're saying that Jews only in India were never oppressed?
Yes.
And so it's...
Yeah, you're right, but I'm not sure, by the way, that most of these people know that, number one. And number two, the Jewish community in India, that history is so minuscule in a way, okay, that doesn't frankly enter into it. If one were to, let's say, write a whole book on this slide, okay, and its permutations and ramifications, yes, I would probably bring that in at some point. But what would be the principal considerations? Because look at it. Are you willing to fight back and protect Hinduism and Judaism? Of course, some cynic might say the Hindus are barely able to protect themselves. How on earth are they going to protect the Jews? Right? Some cynic might come along and say that that's the real element of absurdity. But I don't believe that that's the most interesting argument, again, that one might come up with regarding what is going on here. Did somebody have their hand up? You did, yeah. Okay, so that there's a common history of being victimized briefly, right? A common history of being victimized, but look, I think all Africans were victimized. Okay? Now, it doesn't say, are you willing to fight back and protect Hinduism, Judaism, and the religions of Africa? No. In fact, you could say that large number of Muslims were victimized as well. So, I agree with you. You're on the right track, but I'm just trying to get absolutely on the right track. I'm just trying to get a slightly more specific answer. And if you could try to speak up a bit, yeah.
Maybe because they're trying to make, like, both of them trying to make their own state, kind of. So, like, Hindus believe maybe if they take out the Muslims from India, then they can have their own Hindu state, and then Judaism maybe.
Yeah, absolutely plausible argument. Yeah, I mean that if indeed actually the Jews were able to get a separate state, the state of Israel, that this is something that the Hindus ought to aspire to, and so they can look to Israel in that respect as a model, right? Okay, so that's absolutely. I mean, no question about it. That would be one implication and one reason why Hinduism and Judaism are being lumped here together. Yes. Yes, but when it says to fight back and protect, okay, now it would be very hard to argue that Jews in America are living in conditions of duress. In other words, it's not like they need protection.
Well, I'm saying for Israel.
For Israel.
That's what I'm talking about. They have the means, perhaps, to actually make an impact.
Okay. All right, so fine. Let's just sharpen it a bit. I'm not going to be able to take any more because we're not going to be able to finish if we continue to take comments on this now. Let's just sharpen it a bit. What is Israel? Well, how does it project itself? It projects itself as a democracy. Okay? Surrounded by tyrannical / authoritarian / despotic Muslim states. That's what it projects itself. I mean, that Israel is the only real democracy. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm saying that's the projection. Okay? We're not here going to be able to evaluate to what extent Israel is a democracy or to what extent any country that calls itself a democracy really is one. But that is the common perception, that Israel is a democracy in the Middle East and it's surrounded by a sea of enemies. And what is India? The only real democracy, again, in South Asia. It's surrounded by Pakistan, Afghanistan, right? Then you've got Bangladesh, right? And of course, some people might quibble and say, well, Bangladesh is a democracy too, but it's a Muslim majority state. Muslim majority state. Important consideration is that India has suffered at the hands of Muslim terrorism, as has Israel. Okay? This is central to the argument over here. Because, let me put it to you in a nutshell, there is no question that over the course of the last 20 years, the most significant shift in Indian foreign policy, or at least one of the most significant shifts in Indian foreign policy, is closer ties to Israel. Most of you in this room will not know that India did not even have diplomatic relations with Israel for a very long period of time. India was much closer to the Arab states. All right? Now all of that has changed completely. In fact, it is now more or less a standing joke that, once you finish your term as general, brigadier general, or major general in the Israel army, where do you go for having a nice vacation? And not only a nice vacation, but then you go and offer your services as a consultant India. Right? The Indian Defense Department is inviting all these Israeli generals, well, all right, now you come and, advise us, guide us. Why? Because that's the other important element in the picture that we have to bring in. Many Hindu nationalists view Israel as a no-nonsense state. No-nonsense state means Israel knows how to deal with enemies. It knows how to deal with traitors. It knows how to deal with dissenters. They are not soft and effeminate like us Hindus. Let us learn from Israel how to deal with the enemy. A very strong sentiment of this kind is to be found in certain sectors of Hindu nationalist organizations. That's one reason why they've been calling for very close cooperation with Israel. Right? That Israel knows how to deal. It will not tolerate, right, this kind of cultural pluralism that allows everybody a free hand in everything. It knows how to have security, so forth and so on. So we're seeing there are multiple things here. This idea that Israel is a democracy, like India, it's besieged by Muslims, it's surrounded by Muslims. Right? Israel has suffered at the hands of Muslim terrorists, of course Palestinians and others as well. And similarly, India has suffered at the hands of Muslim terrorists. And in fact, the Hindu nationalists are very keen. They think that what is really going to be the foundational alliance in the future, from their point of view, the foundational alliance is a tripartite alliance between the three greatest democracies in the world, all three of which have suffered at the hands of Muslim terrorists: India, Israel, and the United States. That's what they're looking for, is a kind of a tripartite alliance of these three states. Okay? And this is a very good indication of where they would want to go. Of course, some of them will not, by the way, go as far as HinduUnity.org to project it in this particular way, because you have to be diplomatic. And this Bajrang Dal does not believe in being diplomatic at all. I mean, they believe in muscle power. And so that's what the Bajrang Dal advocates do on the streets of India. They go about terrorizing people. Right? And then HinduUnity.org has put forward one of the persons that they projected as their great heroes is Narendra Modi. Who is Narendra Modi? He's a chief minister of the state of Gujarat. Okay, 2002, when the pogrom took place that I referred to in my previous lecture, he was the chief minister of Gujarat at that point in time. And then at the bottom of there, they have, of course, is a picture of Bin Laden, and it says USA heading towards more liberal Muslim appeasement. You see, so it's a warning to the US too that you're too soft towards the Muslims. You appease them too much. All right. So I think that what I've tried to establish here is a number of things. One of them has to do with the deployment of the internet. The other has to do with transformations taking place within Hinduism itself. And finally, and both of these figure into the third point here, and that is the fact that the Indian community in the United States has now grown to certain proportions that it can begin to seek to have influence in the determination of foreign policy. Right? That's how at least the community would like to view itself. And of course you're going to see correspondingly a different kind of involvement in politics, more Indians running for the Senate, for the House, in local elections, so forth and so on. For the president. At some point, yes, unquestionably. Yeah. All right, any questions about this particular set of arguments that I've talked about through this PowerPoint having to do with internet Hinduism? All right, let me suggest a few other things now. So what we have had so far is we've had a number of multiple trajectories. One is a trajectory which was a chronological narrative, by and large, which took us to the history of Indians in the US till 1965, right? And we tried to understand, well, what were some of the problems that Indians had, what were the ways in which they were excluded, the long years of exclusion. And then, of course, in 1965, with the passage of a new Immigration Act, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, this situation is going to begin to alter. And I had spoken in passing. I didn't give you any census figures as such for the most part. I mean, I gave you census figures from Chicago. And in passing, what I'd spoken about was the growth of the Indian community from 1965 down to the present day. And one of the things I'd suggested was that you find a tendency among Indians in the United States to gravitate towards the larger metropolitan areas. Okay? The second trajectory is a trajectory of how Hindus in particular, with again passing reference to Sikhs and Muslims, but how Hindus in particular have attempted to practice their faith in the United States, what has been the growth of Hinduism in the United States, and in order to understand that, we've had to look at some earlier conceptions, okay, of Hinduism that prevailed in the United States in the late 19th century, the institutional origins, if I may put it this way, of Hinduism, such related notions as yoga. How did yoga come about in the US? Again, in passing by and large, because what we were really looking at was, you go back to mid-1960s again, you get the Hare Krishnas coming into the United States, the community begins to grow, and what you have is the emergence of such things as temple Hinduism, and more recently, internet Hinduism, okay, of which I've given you, one set of arguments having to do with this internet Hinduism. Now I want to look very briefly at some other interesting developments within the Indian community, which point to the ways in which they have attempted to accommodate themselves to American culture, how they have made inroads into American society, how they have attempted to establish themselves. And what I want to look at in particular here very briefly, and you have a reading there which speaks to these set of concerns, is the growth of the Gujarati population, and in particular how the motel industry became so closely associated with the Gujarati community. Okay, so the reading that you have is a very recent book that's come out by Pawan Dhingra, Life Behind the Lobby, where he describes how Gujaratis eventually came to have such a firm grasp and grip over the motel industry. Okay, because as he points out, and as many others have pointed out, in fact, I have a segment on this of about 5 or 6 pages in this book, which was obviously written several years before Dhingra's entire monograph on the motel industry. That in the United States, especially in places like California, and particularly when you look at budget motels, the Indian domination is extraordinary. Okay, really extraordinary. There is an Asian American Association of Hotels, AAHOA. I forget what the exact name stands for. I think it's Asian American Hospitality Organization of America or something like that. I refer to that in my book. That title, by the way, is misleading. That's what the organization calls itself, because the bulk of these motel owners are Indians. They're not. It's not a generic category of Asian Americans that we're really speaking of. And within the Indians, the bulk of these motel owners are actually Gujaratis. And then within the Gujaratis, they tend to be Patels, and there are a couple of other related names, Shahs, for example, Bhaktas. But these are the subcastes that we're really talking about, that the bulk of them are actually people coming from the central and southern districts of Gujarat. Now, if you follow Dhingra's history, he points out that the first Indian American owned motel was in San Francisco. This was a motel that was actually owned by a Japanese American, and you know what happened to the Japanese Americans, of course, during World War II, right? After Pearl Harbor, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, by an executive order passed by President Roosevelt, Japanese Americans were all sent to internment camps. They're not usually called concentration camps. That uglier word is usually used for what happened in Nazi Germany. They're called internment camps, and that's where the Japanese Americans were sent, the entire population of Japanese Americans. Now, this particular motel was owned by a Japanese American, and its owner was also sent to an internment camp. And those are the circumstances under which this Indian was able to actually eventually lease the motel. And what Dhingra describes in the book is the process through which, beginning with this motel ownership, and you know where the word motel comes from, right? Okay, it's an amalgamation of motorways plus hotel. So the motel is a particular American institution. You didn't really have motels in places like Germany and Britain and France. It's a very particular kind of American institution, and it's related obviously to the interstate system here. which was one of the major American investments in the beginning in the period, during the war and after the war, the expansion of the American interstate or freeway or highway system. There are different words that are used for it, but we're talking about the same thing. Okay, and obviously the motel became a necessity because the United States, particularly the western part of the United States, is an automobile culture. I will, in passing, recommend a book, which is really an extraordinary book, because it'll give you some insight into this particular culture that we're talking about. And it's only in that backdrop can we understand the emergence of the motel. And this is a book by a British architect, Reinhard Banham, who came to California in the mid-1960s, I think for the first time, and wrote what in my view is still one of the 2 or 3 best books ever written on Los Angeles. And this book is called The 4 Ecologies, because he argues, the 4 ecologies of Los Angeles, he argues that Los Angeles is unique because it's the only place in the world where 4 ecological systems meet. What are these 4 ecological systems? Does anybody want to take a quick stab at it? What might these 4 ecologies might be? The ocean? Huh?
The mountains.
Okay, the mountains. The desert. The desert, the mountains, the ocean. That's 3. What's the 4th one? Huh? No, but that's not. I mean, you can have agriculture areas. I mean, the 4 distinct ecologies. Madhu? The freeway. You must have heard that from me. Yeah, that's what I thought. Because nobody's ever been able to answer that question. So that's why I was quite sure you must have heard that from me. The freeways. That this is almost like an ecological system in this part of the world. Okay? And it is distinct. It has shaped the ethos, for better or for worse, of this part of the country. Okay? So the motel is an institution, is an American institution that develops in this context. Okay, so now we go back to the history. 1940s, the first motel taken over in San Francisco. If you read the Dhingra book, he says that some of the people who started buying motels after this one, and then a couple more were purchased, they gravitated towards San Francisco partly because the climate was nice and because there was an earlier history. What was that earlier history? The Ghaddar movement. That some of them were aware of this earlier Indian presence, and frankly, not much of a presence in the Los Angeles area. Right? I mean, if you go back to the history that I've given you and the history that you can read in any other number of texts, that when we speak about the presence of Indians, right, we have largely been speaking, at least as the first 2 decades of the 20th century are concerned, about San Francisco and the Bay Area. And of course, north of that, going to Vancouver, to Canada, but then eventually, that whole strip over there, Washington State. You don't really find much of an Indian presence in Southern California, okay, until much, much later. And in fact, I would argue really that the bulk of it is going to go back to obviously 1965 and the Immigration Act. I mean, there were some Indians, in fact, I know a couple of Indians in this area who first came to this area in the 1950s. But you're really speaking about a handful for the most part. All right? So they gravitate towards San Francisco. They start acquiring motels. And without getting into the detailed sociology of this, because Dhingra, I think, does an adequate job, he describes the conditions under which they left. Right? Very briefly, why were these people willing to leave Gujarat? Because he goes back to the colonial period, that if you look at the late 19th century, late 1800s, 1890s, moving into the early 1900s, over 1 million people died in Gujarat. You've got plague epidemic, you've got drought, you've got famine. Okay, Gujaratis also had a history of migration, as I've suggested to you. Right? Gujaratis had a history of migration, and then his argument, I'm not sure that argument can be entirely sustained, but it's not critical to what we want to do. And that argument is that even after independence, Gujarat was not really doing that well. Okay, so that even though it had high rates of literacy, high degree of urbanization, and high degree of industrialization, that on many other social indices, Gujarat did very poorly. Infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates were much higher in Gujarat than in many other Indian states. Agricultural yield was very poor. Irrigation facilities were very poor. What he's doing there in the first part of the reading that you have is he's setting up the backdrop. So you can understand how these Gujaratis decided to make their way to the United States. And of course we know that some of them made their way not just to the United States, but they went to places like East Africa, and some of them had gone to East Africa much earlier. If you recall that entire discussion in the first segment of the course about the Indian diaspora in places like Africa, and so on. And the people that he interviewed, and we don't know whether this is a representative sample or not, but I think that the numbers would be true vis-a-vis the larger group, not just the people that he interviewed. Of the people that he interviewed, roughly 1/5 of the Gujaratis are people who had come from East Africa. Okay? Well, they had come from places other than India. They might not all have come from East Africa. Some of them might have come from Britain. Some of the Indians had gone to Britain first, and then from Britain they made their way to the United States. Okay? But it's very clear that what he's suggesting is that for various reasons, America appeared to be a more hospitable place, particularly as the screws got tightened on the Indians in Britain. Right? Remember 1962, an Immigration Act is passed in Britain which begins to put some restrictions on entry of Indians, even though it's a Commonwealth country, into Britain. Then in 1968, this is going to be further tightened. And it's going to be further tightened because there's going to be an argument made that even if you have a British passport, you're not automatically entitled to enter the United Kingdom unless one of your parents or grandparents was born, okay, in Britain. And of course, most of the Indians couldn't claim that. So all of that is very clear. Now, what we need to concentrate on, I just want to take a couple of minutes to set it up, and I'll speak a little bit more about this on Tuesday, is what is it that made the motels, what is it that made them attractive to the Gujaratis? Okay? And so he suggests a number of things, and again, much of this is corroborated by the evidence we have from a large number of other sources, and some of this is what you might describe as fairly common sense. So for one thing, you have this chain reaction, right? That once a group of people began to do certain things, right, in this case, move into the motel industry, other people within that community will feel similarly attracted to do that, impelled to do that. And so this is a phenomenon that's quite common. Now, however, there are things which are uncommon about this phenomenon. And what are those things that are uncommon? Because he's saying that, look, we can make an argument to the effect that most immigrant groups create a certain kind of niche for themselves. And so an immigrant group becomes, let's say, highly prevalent or representative in one kind of industry. Other immigrants from the same community will gravitate towards the same industry. Okay? But he says that this is not enough to explain why so many Gujaratis, started gravitating towards the motel industry. And he's saying that it's unusual in two respects. One is that this is intergenerational. It's intergenerational. That very often what you find in an immigrant community is that, okay, the immigrant community creates a niche, and then, across one generation, they continue to be interested in that, but then the children in the second generation will say, well, we want a different kind of social mobility, right? Simply because our parents and our uncles and aunts all owned laundries doesn't mean that we're going to have laundromats too, right? Even though this is available to us. That's the niche. It's available to you. You want to own a laundromat? Well, 10 people in the family own a laundromat. You can own one too. But the children say, no, we want a certain kind of social mobility, hopefully an upward social mobility. So he's saying that this is what makes the Gujarati motel experience different. Number one, it is intergenerational. There are still a significant number of Gujaratis in this generation who still want to enter into this business. Their numbers have proportionately declined, but it's still much larger than the number of people from other communities who might want to enter into this particular business. Right? So number one, it's intergenerational, and secondly, it has a wide geographic span. It's not simply in the state of California that the Gujaratis dominate the budget motel industry. They do so in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Arizona, in New York, in New Jersey. Right? And he says that this is again something that distinguishes Gujarati motel ownership from other kinds of ethnic entrepreneurship, which model, he says, may not be entirely successful in being able to explain what the Gujaratis are doing. So we're going to stop here, and I'm going to continue with this on Tuesday.